can start with like, your earliest memories, like things like where you're born, raised, those kind of things can be interesting to start with.
Okay. I was born in the south of Scotland in a place called Hawick that, as far as I know, has always been known as the home of famous knitwear companies like Pringles and Leyland Scots and
Mm.
Braemar. Anyway, I was born there. I went to school in the uh, high school, primary school, which sounds like a contradiction in terms, but that's what it was called. We had the local secondary school. Hawick, by the way, is in the borders of Scotland,
Mm.
roughly has a population of about 17,000 people. It is located in a valley, as a lot of the border towns are. So it is very much a law unto itself, has a very interesting dialect, which can be traced back to Germanic roots.
Mm.
We, instead of saying you and me, say jou and my, which is more Dutch than English. Um, so we're quite known for that in the borders as being the jou and mais. Anyway, I went to the high school, primary school. Had a pretty uneventful time there. Uh, I suppose, partly class clown and partly disruptive child.
Mm.
I was always, mm, well, I hesitate to say bored at school, but I suppose I was. I always found the teachers would explain something, and I'd think, okay, that's it, and then they would go over it again. I would think, well, yeah, we've got that. Move on, move on. And because I got bored, I would get in trouble. Um, so I was not a model student by any stretch of the imagination. Um, I did discover at a fairly early age that I did have a facility for languages. People tend to say a talent, but I think a talent is a degree higher than in my case. I think
Mm.
I have a facility for languages. I find them fairly easy to pick up and learn, but I have known genuinely talented linguists, and I'm nowhere near that. Um, when I went to secondary school, we started, we did Latin and French, which I found fascinating. I had the choice of doing ancient Greek, classical Greek, but decided not to, and did Latin and French. Then, within a couple of years at secondary school, we then did Spanish, and I found Spanish. I still to this day find it a language which is fairly easy for me to understand passively, but I hesitate to speak the language because I'm not very good at it. I can get by, I can order meals and find
Mm.
my way around in Spain, but as I say, I have a higher level of passive knowledge of the language. I eventually, and I maybe cut off a couple of things. I left school in the fifth year when I did my O levels because I was so tired of school. I should have stayed on to do my hires, as is normal in Scotland, but I wasn't interested, so I left and I worked. I worked in a grocer's for a while. I started a big a baking apprenticeship. Um, which actually, when I look back on it, was one of the more interesting jobs I have done. I realize a lot of employers of mine would be very annoyed to hear that, but uh, yeah, I started an apprenticeship. I was actually really genuinely interested in baking. I was quite good at it, and I also did confectionery. We done decorate simple
Mm,
cakes and this kind
mm.
of thing, which I absolutely loved. Um,
I mean, can I just
uh,
interrupt quickly?
yes,
Do you still have some of those skills you got from there?
yes. I still occasionally bake. I like making croissant, um,
Mm,
which is quite a complicated
complicated one. Yeah.
procedure, but I love the feel of croissant dough. It's just absolutely a lovely feeling. It's just very much a pleasure to work with. And I have varying results with it. The first time I tried to make croissants, they were very successful. And and then I think my level of croissant baking has gone down ever since. So yes, as I say, I still enjoy doing that kind of thing. I also love cooking
Mm,
because my mother, God bless her, was a terrible cook. So when I was about 12 years old, um, we had been to Austria,
mm,
and I loved the food and coffee and all sorts of things I was introduced to at the age of 12. And I decided to teach myself how to cook because I knew from my experience in Austria that the food could be much better than it was
mm,
than the food I was getting at home.
mm,
Um, so there we go. Um, so to go back to the baking, I eventually left there and went to work for one of the knitwear companies in Hawick, and I decided to leave it and go back and do my hires because somebody I spoke to had convinced me that I really was just wasting my time and I really should be going to university. And the only way I could do that would be by doing my hires. So I went back and I was very fortunate to have a teacher who had just come back from Moscow and he had done an intensive course in Russian. And I really liked the guy. And he
mm.
also taught German. So I did German and Russian with him. So I was very fortunate to have a secondary school where I did Latin, French, Spanish,
Mm.
badly, Russian, and German. As I say, I was very fortunate to have that experience. Um, so I did my hires after that break of a couple of years and decided I would want to study French and German. So I applied to Heriot Watt University in Edinburgh and matriculated there. And I was ready to go to Heriot Watt and study French and German and potentially become a French and German teacher.
Mm.
Um, and then I was working in the summer. I did a job at a blanket company in Hawick. They made blankets. It's a complicated story. Um, and one Friday afternoon, I received the Hawick News, which was our local newspaper. And on the back page, they had job adverts. And you have to realize, as I say, I had already matriculated at university and I was ready to go there. And and the advert was from the Royal Air Force. And it said, I'll never forget it, good at languages, interested in radio, we have a job for you. And I
Mm.
thought, this advert was aimed at me. This was specifically aimed at me, because by then I was a shortwave listener. Had been for I started at the age of 10.
Oh.
And so I was, really interested in radio. My dad was very, very talented at radio. He'd been a wireless mechanic in the Royal Air Force during the Second World War, and so I was used to radios and electronics and this kind of thing in the house. So I started off as a shortwave listener. So this advert, good at languages, yes. Interested in radio, yeah. It's my hobby. I love it. So I applied to the Royal Air Force in Edinburgh. Went up to Edinburgh. It was really interesting because on my way there, I got caught in an absolute downpour, as can always happen in Scotland. And I had put on my collar and tie and my good trousers and my good shoes, and I was absolutely soaked from top to bottom. So I thought, they're never going to accept me. But they did. And I said, well, what is this job? And they said, oh, we can't tell you what the job is. Which obviously intrigued me. And they said, what we will do is we'll send you down to England for a language aptitude test. And depending on how well you do, you may study Russian, Polish, German, and at the time, those were the languages which were available. Chinese was available, but only to civilians. So I thought, yeah, nothing to lose. I've already have a place at university if I want to go there. So I went down and did the language test at a place called North Luffenham in Rutland, England's smallest county, and also the home of Melton Mowbray pork pies. Very important people. And it was interesting. We had 1 hour to learn an artificial language, a language which had been completely made up. It was not related in any way to any language. We had 1 hour to learn the basic number system, quite a large vocabulary of nouns, the basic grammar of the language. And I remember still to this day, 1, 2, 3, Wakonadu, Mirdon, Tara, Borgin, were 1 to 4. That was a long time ago, but I've never forgotten these words. And after this hour, we were given the task of translating a document written in this artificial language that we'd had 1 hour to prepare. And I did as well as I could at it, and discovered that I had in fact done exceptionally well at the language test. So I was allowed to study Russian in the Air Force.
I'll like interrupt you a bit because I mean quite a bit of things to unpack.
Yeah.
So like a couple of things I really want to touch is like your parents. It seems like some of the things you picked up from your dad, like his understanding about electronic things, like radio. Did he speak any other language himself?
No.
Okay.
I remember him saying one word in German after we'd been in Austria. And the word was jawohl.
What does it mean?
No, that was the one word. Jawohl just means yes. It's a very emphatic way of saying yes. Or, yeah, really, And he said that I didn't say it correctly. I said jawohl because I picked up a couple of words of German when we were in Austria. That was at the age of 10. And my father, as I say, oh yes, he was stationed in the Royal Air Force during the Second World War in Egypt,
Okay.
which was the absolute highlight of his life. He spoke about practically nothing else for the rest of his life. I knew all of his stories of what he did when he was in Alexandria and what he did when he was in Mersa Matruh and when he was in Cairo. And he learned, they had some Italian prisoners of war, and from them he learned 5.555.
God.
5,555. That was the extent of my father's knowledge of languages. Was 5.555 and jawohl. When I was learning French, my mother, who also was monolingual, would help me with my French. And my dad, I could not do it when my dad was there. Because he hated the French. And he said to me, French will not be spoken, sung, or whistled in this house, which was an unusual way of putting it. He had a strange sense of humor, my dad.
Do you think like your dad's this expedition during the Second World War in Egypt, it kind of opened up some kind of different world, but also that kind of came to you as well. It's a kind of romantic idea about the another world.
I think so. Without wandering into any political aspects of the Middle East, which I understand are extremely important. I don't think there's any doubt at all that this experience, and he was not alone in this. He was a, if I can put it this way, it sounds terrible, but I have to put it this way. He was a simple, straightforward, working class man from the south of Scotland, and lived in this very narrow-minded, very isolated small town in the south of Scotland, went to war and experienced for the first time all the English accents, all the accents of the United Kingdom, and then was sent to Egypt. And he went to Egypt on the troop ship, which was the Queen Mary. And funnily enough, I have been on the Queen Mary, which is docked in Long Beach in California.
Wow.
So many years after my dad was on it. So he had this experience of being on the Queen Mary. They, of course, went down by the Cape and back round again and up and through the Suez Canal because they couldn't go through the Mediterranean at that time. And there's no question, it was absolutely the highlight of his life, and he lived it daily, ever after. He also was very, very tanned, something which I have not. I've got typical Scottish skin.
Yeah.
And this, by the way, my cheeks are the result of working outside today in the in the March sun of Scotland, and I get red cheeks from it. My dad was quite dark brown, with and he was often taken for an Arab.
Wow!
Because he was very dark, and I think that also reflected the way he felt. I think he was very, very comfortable in his time in Egypt, and he was respected as a wireless mechanic. He was very good at his job. And he was very proud of it. So I think possibly the seeds of travel were planted because of my dad talking about this wonderful experience in Egypt.
I mean, especially like when you came to this like crossroad of your life, one is university and other one is just straight to job. That's
Yeah.
like quite a big thing to choose, I mean, as a young man.
Oh, yes, very, very much. Um, and I suppose the fact that my father had been in the Air Force,
Mm,
no coincidence that apart from the fact that this job, which involved Russian and radio,
mm,
didn't take much imagination to imagine what the job was.
mm.
The fact that it was for the Air Force was no coincidence that I decided, oh yes,
Mm.
I too am going to go off and join the Air Force. um, uh, yeah, we did a 1 year intensive course after going through basic training
Mm.
in the Air Force, the usual nonsense about learning how to march and how to salute and all the rest of it. You salute, by the way, in the Royal Air Force, 1.5 inches behind your eye, like
Okay.
this. Absolute nonsense. I had no time at all for the military aspects
Mm,
of
mm,
being in the Air Force. Anyway, we did a year's intensive course with native Russian speakers.
mm, mm,
This was 1967, which was the height of the Cold War. So
mm,
all of these native Russians were defectors
mm.
from the Soviet Union. One of my favorite teachers had the most unlikely name of Fyodor Fyodorovich Fyodorov. We called him Fred. Uh, Obviously, I suppose, with the British sense of humor. We had another teacher called Mandrei Mathuzela, who I
Mm,
think came from Lithuania.
mm,
Um, a Herr Kravchenko
mm,
from the Ukraine. So we had defectors from all over the place teaching us
mm.
Russian. Um, Fyodor Fyodorovich Fyodorov used to say to me, "Oh, why you all time sleep?" Because I used to fall asleep in his classes, which later on as a teacher, I realized it's one of the worst things a student can do to you is to fall asleep during one of your lessons. And it wasn't because I wasn't enjoying the lesson, but it was because I was usually out at night, carousing and doing other things with my time, as well as studying. We had to
Mm.
study very hard. We had to learn about 50 words a night.
Does it mean, because it looks like you are part of this military kind of structure, does it mean you had to go through all those physical training as well?
Yes,
Okay.
yes. We did 6 weeks basic training,
Mm.
which in other contexts is known as boot camp,
Okay.
where the first thing they do is give you a haircut. I mean, any totalitarian regime controls your hair first.
Wow.
Terrible thing to say about the Royal Air
Mm.
Force, but the military in general will first of all control your hair, because he who controls your hair controls
Mm.
what you do. And yeah, as I say, we learned how to march
Mm.
and also how to shoot. Um, I was actually, unfortunately, I kind of hate to admit it now, but I found shooting rifles very interesting, and I was actually good at it. And I got a marksman's badge, which was crossed rifles, which I was allowed to sew onto my uniform. And I
Mm.
think I got 2 and 6pence a week extra wages for it, or something like that. Which which back then meant 2 pints of beer, which was quite a considerable thing for me.
Yeah.
Uh, um, yeah, and when we then after this basic training, after they taught us, I mean, you had to polish your badge and you had to learn how to bull your boots. So you know your boots
Mm.
were were beautifully shining, and your badge had to be perfect, and your bed had to be made perfectly. All sorts of nonsense, basically, really. But when we finished the Russian course, it was spring 1968, and known as the Czech Spring. And I was stationed immediately on leaving the language school. I was stationed in Lincolnshire and went straight into more or less active duty. We were on a wartime footing because the Warsaw Pact had just invaded Czechoslovakia. And I discovered that my job was in signals intelligence, listening to the Russian Air Force, which I'm allowed to say now, but at the time was strictly forbidden to say what my job was. And we went onto a war footing. So immediately on leaving the language school, I was on 8 hours on, 8 hours off. And that's what we worked. 8 hours on, 8 hours off, 8 hours on, 8 hours off. Because it was a very busy time. I can't remember what we must obviously have had days off, but I can't remember. And that went on for several months. And then I was stationed. Then I was asked where I wanted to serve. Did I want to go to Cyprus or did I want to go to Berlin? And I chose Cyprus, so the Air Force sent me to Berlin. That's the way the military does it. You want to go to Cyprus? Okay, we'll send you to Berlin. Which now I'm very glad of, because I arrived in Berlin in October 1968 and got off the plane and smelt the air and thought, I have arrived in my spiritual home. It was very, very striking, the feeling, this is where I belong. It was funny because, as I said earlier, my dad really didn't like the French, but he loved the Germans, which is very interesting considering they had been the enemy during the war. But he loved the Germans, and it's again, it's probably not a coincidence that I ended up in Germany. And as I say, I arrived in Berlin 1968, which was the revolutionary time in Europe. The Germans to this day refer to the 68er, the 68ers. People of my generation who took to the streets and demonstrated against the Vietnam War and the capitalist system. When first time I was in the Kudamm, the main road in West Berlin, I remember the smell of tear gas. And I thought that I thought the Kudamm always smelt the tear gas, because when I went there had always just recently been a demonstration and the police had tear gassed the demonstrators. It was an exciting time to be alive, and
that's the time where all those revolutionaries are kind of popping up everywhere.
Oh, so yes,
I think like Germany is like Red Army, isn't it? Or
the Red Army faction came later.
Okay.
Yes, but there were people like Rudi Dutschke, who was shot and killed by the police. It's interesting now in Berlin there is the Rudi Dutschke Straße. How O tempus o mores, how things have changed. That there is now a Rudi Dutschke Straße named after Rudi Dutschke, who was one of the student leaders.
I'll be really interested about, this Cold War Berlin, because Berlin it's quite a like structure during that time. Obviously,
yeah.
it was like divided in like 4 or 5 things.
Yeah, it was split into, well, basically East and West to start with. And many people, I would say possibly even most people in Britain, to this day don't know that Berlin was an island, basically, completely isolated in the middle of East Germany. British people, Germans always refer to it as the DDR, the GDR.
Yeah.
British people steadfastly refuse to call it that. They always call it East German. The British ability not to accept any political name that they don't like. Yeah, so it was basically split into East and West. The East was run by the Soviet Union, which it was also called the capital of the GDR, which was against international law because the Soviet Union had agreed, I believe, when they signed the Potsdam Agreement at the end of the war, they agreed that Berlin, no part of Berlin would be the capital. But after setting up the GDR, the Soviet Union decided that it was okay to call East Berlin the capital of the GDR. So anyway, the West in the north of Berlin was run by the French. In the southwest was run by the British, and the rest was run by the Americans. They were individual sectors. So you had the American sector, the British sector, the French sector, and the Russian or the Soviet sector. There were signs which are famously photographed. You are entering the American sector, you are leaving the British sector, etc., etc. And we were completely surrounded by the Berlin Wall. And where I was stationed in RAF Gatow, we were about 1.5 miles from the outer Berlin Wall that was between West Berlin and the GDR. We weren't far from Potsdam, which was in the east. And at night, I remember lying in bed and listening to the machine guns being fired by the border guards on the Berlin Wall. And we realized that if they wanted to invade West Berlin, they would arrive at our barracks after about maybe 20 minutes, probably longer, because we would have tried to stop them, but in effect, we couldn't have stopped them. If they had wanted to invade West Berlin, they could have, but we were there more or less as a trigger. The British Army was there, the Americans were there, the American Army, American Air Force, the French Army and the French Air Force. The French were based in Tegel, which later on became one of Berlin's airports. And the American Air Force were based in Tempelhof, which is one of the famous airports in Berlin, which has been closed for many years. And Gatow was the RAF base there. And as I say, we were about 1.5 miles, perhaps 2 miles from the Berlin Wall. And it was interesting because anywhere you drove in Berlin, eventually you would come to the wall. And I think it was one of these concentrating situations where if you are concentrated on an island, even if it is in the middle of the country, it was still an island, basically. You have a heightened sense of togetherness. It was an amazing demographic because after the Second World War, I mean, this was only 23 years after the war. Mm-hmm. Most of the men had been killed in Berlin, and the demographic was older people, mostly widows, and it was an interesting mix of people. You also had very many young people there who had come from West Germany, because if you lived in West Berlin, you did not have to do military service because there was conscription in the West. So a lot of people would go to Berlin and live their best life in Berlin because they were quite safe and didn't have to go to the military. So there was a lot of youth culture, a lot of marijuana was smoked. I remember walking into student pubs and student bars. There were a lot of student bars in Berlin, and the smell was overwhelming. It was quite amazing. So there was a vibrant music scene there. Culturally, Berlin had always been the decadent center of Germany, and they managed to live a pretty decadent life. There were no closing times. Pubs were open theoretically 24 hours a day. So life went on 24 hours a day. It was an amazing atmosphere. If you wanted to leave Berlin, as a member of the Allied forces, you could only fly, and you could only fly along one of three corridors: Hamburg, or down the middle, or down the south to Munich. And for military road traffic, you could only go from West Berlin to Helmstedt, which was due west from West Berlin. And you had to travel through East Germany. We were not, the Allied troops were not allowed to deal with the East Germans because we didn't recognize the GDR as a separate political entity. But people who did my job were not allowed to travel by road on their own. We would travel in convoy with a police escort at the front and a police escort at the back. That was how it happened. You could also take the train. There was a British military train, went from West Berlin to West Germany, and you could take that as well.
But at the same time, these transports are going through East Germany.
Yes. But, for example, if you got the train, if you got the British military train, I can't remember, I think it went twice a day, but I can't remember. You had to get a special travel document to take in. And when it got to the Berlin Wall, it stopped, and all of the doors were locked, and windows were locked, and the East Germans would search underneath the train. They would send dogs along underneath the train to check if anyone was trying to escape. Then when you got, and then they would change the locomotive to an East German locomotive, which then took you through East Germany. When you got to the West German border, it stopped again, and the East Germans would they would send dogs and put mirrors underneath the train to see if anyone was trying to escape. And then they changed the locomotive again, and you proceeded into West Germany when they could open the doors and the windows again. So there was no possibility of either getting out of the train or someone getting into the train when you went through it. There was only a military train.
I mean, this sounds like a film.
Yes, and it was. I mean, it was genuinely exciting. It was quite amazing.
But
Yeah.
but also there was a risk as well.
Things could have gone wrong, and in reality, they didn't. Fortunately, they didn't. I don't believe there were ever any incidents involving the military train or military troops going through East Germany. The friends of mine who were not doing my job, because we were cleared up to quite a high level of security. But friends who were not doing my job, who could travel down the corridor, as we called it, we called it down the zone. They only dealt with the Russians, and then when they got to the other end, they dealt with the Russians. But they had to be very careful because the speed limit through East Germany was 100 kilometers per hour, and they had to be careful not to exceed that, because they would get in trouble, and the East Germans would try to find them, and there were potentially a lot of areas where things could have gone wrong. But I think everyone was very aware of the fact that that peaceful coexistence was a much better idea. It's interesting looking back at it now, and it's quite amazing that there were no really serious incidents that we heard about.
Because, like, I mean, I'm seeing like a couple of things here. Like, one is like you are saying that there's like vibrant social life, nightlife, everything was normal, everything was exciting, but also there are serious military apparatus all over the place.
All over the place. Yep.
I mean, so like how normal it was, especially for you who was involved in that security apparatus.
It is really interesting that I think it's a sign, and something I learned, that really human beings can accommodate themselves to the most unusual, unnatural conditions. And when you think of it, to be hemmed in, to be locked in behind the wall, is by no means at all normal. Another thing that would happen frequently, the Russian Air Force would break the sound barrier. They would do this over West Berlin deliberately. So you heard sonic booms quite frequently. But we were used to it. It was just, this was normality, You would see tanks, British tanks, traveling down the road. Not far from us, there was a barracks, and quite normal to see tanks and on the road, and troop carriers and all sorts of things. Just this was just normality for us. By the way, on RAF Gatto, we had a 9-hole golf course, which is absurd, built by a Scotsman by the name of MacGregor, and his son, and he must have been, I mean, to me, he was ancient, so he must have been in his 50s or 60s, Mr. MacGregor. I can't remember his first name. And they designed and built a 9-hole golf course on our base, on our RAF Gatto. And people played. I played on the course. I'm probably historically one of the worst players of golf ever, and never improved. But I've loved the game.
So, like, I mean, because I teach politics, I think I'm quite interested about a couple of things, and I think you can be the ideal person who had like kind of normal life there, but also this kind of military structure all around you. So if I see like the Berlin blockade, because you were there, but it happened before you.
Yes.
But you had the understanding, like, what does it mean when you say Berlin blockade? How brutal that blockade was. Like, I mean, because it looks like, there are after Berlin blockade, it seems people can go through all those, like, through road or through like other ways. But
Yes.
Berlin blockade is all about no, it's just airlift, nothing else.
Yes. It's something I find very interesting that again there are many myths concerning the blockade, and the Germans called it die Luftbrücke, the air bridge. Um, and usually nowadays you will hear information on the American involvement in this. The Americans flew to Tempelhof, and but people tend to forget that the British also participated equally well in the air bridge, and flew to RAF Gâteau. The French also had pilots flying in there, and it's amazing. They flew there was an aircraft landing or taking off every few minutes. Every few minutes, they would land. They would be land at Tempelhof or land at Gâteau, landing Tegel, and they would be emptied. They carried coal, sugar, flour, all of the things that the people of Berlin needed, of West Berlin needed. And I think the people of West Berlin were amazed that people who had previously, only a few years earlier, been enemies, risked their lives. I can't remember the numbers off the top of my head, but dozens of American airmen lost their lives. Dozens of Brits lost their pilots, and air crew lost their lives as well, because it was a very dangerous enterprise. And when you fly through the corridor, they were only allowed to fly at the height of, I think, if I remember correctly, 1,000 meters, so 3,000 feet. And they had to fly, which is where the worst of the weather is, and they had to fly at that height. So it was a very dangerous enterprise. And I think the people of West Berlin were, first of all, amazed that their former enemies would do this for them. And I think it was a sign of solidarity, I suppose, with the people of West Berlin that they never really forgot. Obviously, John F. Kennedy, when he visited Berlin, said his famous "Ich bin ein Berliner," which, by the way, in Berlin does not mean a donut. Berliner Pfannkuchen in Berlin is not known as a Berliner. It's known as a Berliner in the rest of Germany, but not in Berlin. And it is in Berlin dialect perfectly normal to say "Ich bin ein Berliner." It's grammatically wrong, but you'll see it on signs and things like that. I think there was a great deal of gratitude amongst the population of West Berlin for what the air forces did, because it was the only means in and out of the city for a year and a half, I think.
Like, do you have any rough idea how much population we are talking about here?
Population of West Berlin in these days was probably 2 million, 2.5 million. Not a huge city in and of itself. Berlin had always been relatively isolated, even before the war. It's a city which is surrounded by countryside all around it. That was not just. So Berlin was an island, but in reality, it had been quite, quite densely populated in the city, but agricultural all around it. So Yeah, and it's an amazing thing when you realize that they kept the city going.
Mm.
The coal was used to for people for heating houses, and it was used to generate electricity for the
Mm.
city. And the city was during the blockade managed to keep going. I'm sure that there weren't many luxuries available to people in West Berlin during the blockade, but they managed to keep living, and they weren't starving,
Mm.
which was
Mm.
an amazing thing to do.
Mm.
An amazing thing.
Because I'm kind of tempted to ask this question. Today's world, like, I mean, when you talk about Gaza, like 12, like 2 million people, and they are starving. And so we can see that how much intervention you need to actually feed people day to day to keep them alive.
Yes.
And that kind of, undertaking by, France, UK, USA, it's a huge apparatus. And
Yeah.
they're like what you were saying, that the planes are flying every minute and coming
Yeah.
back every minute.
Yeah.
It shows like how dreadful the situation is in Gaza. Just unbelievable.
It does, and it shows that the amount of effort put into keeping the people of Berlin alive, as you say, was tremendous in terms of human effort, of people risking their lives, and I suppose at the end of the line you have financially as well. It cost a
Mm,
fortune, of course it did,
mm, mm,
um, and it just shows you how much, as you say, was required to keep
mm,
the population of West Berlin alive. There is nothing even remotely close to that happening in Gaza. They say they would need at least 100 truckloads of goods every day, and they're getting a few dozen in
mm,
perhaps on a good day. It just shows you how inadequate the provision of food and aid to the
mm,
population of Gaza is at the moment. And
mm,
the Americans are trying food
mm,
drops. I'm afraid, to mix the metaphor, it's a drop in the ocean.
mm,
And the Berlin blockade is very, very, very relevant to this. Very relevant.
mm.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for this insight. So, like moving on, um, like going back to your day-to-day job there, it's like fascinating story. Like what kind of job specification for it? I mean, like how, like if someone asked you, like, Colin, what do you do, and what would be your answer in the
My
past?
answer back then was that I worked in an office, and that was it.
Mm,
Um, I just worked in an office.
mm,
We worked in a hangar, um, a converted hangar, which had been used for aircraft by the Luftwaffe during the war. Hangar 4 was the name. It was a big 4 on the door outside it, and our hangar was surrounded by double barbed wire fence, and there were police with dogs patrolling it. It was like a mini version of the Berlin Wall, um,
mm,
because it was top security.
mm,
And without going into any detail, we were monitoring the Soviet Air Force, which completely surrounded Berlin. We were very aware of the fact that the Soviet Air Force was in East Germany alone, was bigger than the entire Royal Air Force at the time. And the Royal Air Force at the time was much bigger than it is now. Um, and we, as always with these kind of endeavors, I think it's more or less the job is to monitor what is normal,
Mm.
what happens every day, all night, so that the minute things deviate from that, you know it. It's an unbelievably expensive thing to do this kind of thing, but
Mm.
that's what happened.
Like, I mean, how much paperwork was involved there? Do you need to, because now the technology changed more or less
Oh
everything.
yeah. I suppose that's why I guess I can talk about it much more freely than I could back then.
Mm.
But it was all paperwork. We had I can show you. This is my amateur radio log.
Okay.
Right.
Oh my God.
Right. Um, so we had logbooks like this. Um, and back in these days, we used carbon paper. So
Ah, yes.
we had the original and in two carbon copies. And as they were speaking, we would write. We would write in abbreviations and then go back when they stopped talking and fill in the abbreviations.
Mm-hmm.
And then you would when you got to the end of the page, you would one would go into the originals, one would go into the second copy, and one would go into the third copy, and you had to do that, which was extremely difficult if there was a lot of activity,
Mm.
and sometimes you'd have two or three of these books with full pages, but you didn't have time to stop, so you would have to you'd have to keep on going, and then hope that there would be a lull where you could go back and fill in the abbreviations. Some of the jobs we had to do were so busy that we would actually have somebody doing nothing else but ripping off the paper and putting the copies in,
Wow.
and adding carbon papers to the next book that you were going to fill. It was just constant. I can still write very quickly, probably faster in Russian than I can in English, because that's what I had to do. I also have high blood pressure now, which is probably a result of that job. Yeah, yeah.
Because I mean, it looks like, because the technology was not there, so it means like you have to use physical,
Yep, we
you
had
know.
earphones on, yeah, and we would have two radios above us, and every position had its own
Mm.
its own particular frequency that it was listening to.
Because these are not normal audio things. These are all kind of noise there as well in between.
Yes, although it was VHF, so the quality was actually very good.
Okay.
Yeah, only for shortwave reception was it sometimes a bit difficult. Like shortwave was done in England, and this was all VHF, so it was all actually very good quality.
Wow.
The first time you hear it, I remember the first time we were allowed to hear it. After 6 months of doing nothing but language, we
Mm.
were then allowed to know what we were doing, and we went into a separate block which was high security, and we then learned what we were doing, and they played us a recording, and this was just a recording of a normal 5 minutes listening to aircraft, and at the end of it the instructor took off his headphones and looked at us, and we were all sitting there literally with tears in our eyes, and everybody said, I can't do this. I couldn't understand a single word that was said, and he said, don't worry, that's normal. This is why you're here, this is why I'm your instructor, and I will teach you how to do it. It is quite amazing when you listen to aircraft, even in your own language. It's very difficult to understand them because they know what they're saying, and the air traffic controllers know what they're going to say more or less, and everybody understands what's going on.
Mm.
It's a very specific esoteric language, that you have to
Mm.
learn.
Mm.
Yeah.
Like in terms of like like the way the call center works, they're like line manager, the floor manager, and all kind of other structure. So
Hmm.
just like trying to visualize like what kind of structure was there. Is it like that kind of office setting, or it's like much more something else?
When I first started, it was more or less rows of desks, like in a school, with a
Okay.
radio at it, and but then it was modernized, and we had a central section where there were different positions with radios at them. Then there was an analyst's room was off to the side, and they would be analyzing everything as it came in
Mm.
and preparing it for it to be sent to London, as it was.
Mm.
We were also in contact with the Americans who were doing the same thing in West Berlin. There was literally a red phone, and they could talk over an encoded line to the American. So yeah.
Because like another close question is, I mean, obviously you knew that the other side also doing the same thing.
Yes. It's very interesting because I have in the meantime, and I would like to visit the place. The Russians were doing exactly the same thing, and the East Germans, but the Russians in particular, just over the border from West Germany, and on up a hill, because you want to get as high as you can so you can listen to more things. They were doing exactly the same thing. They had so. Everybody knows that everybody is being listened to all the time, and normally the discipline, the radio discipline, is very, very tight.
Mm.
But every now and again, somebody will make a mistake and admit something they weren't meant to admit, or if they change their call signs. In the first couple of days, people would use the old one instead of the new one. So immediately that new call sign was compromised
Mm.
because somebody had made a mistake. And it's a game of cat and mouse. And now it's obviously it'll be a completely different thing. It was
Mm.
very primitive back in these days.
Mm. You're still very much expert what's going on around the world in terms of technology. Do you think like things are much more technical rather than the way the human part of the whole thing? Perhaps you don't need human beings at all. The technology can take over the whole thing for you.
I would imagine so. It will largely, and I have absolutely no experience and no idea, but it will be largely done automatically now, I would imagine. But I would still think that the human being's participation in this is still very important.
Mm.
Because you can pick up, for example, accents.
Mm.
I remember listening once to some East German fighters practicing over Peenemünde, which is a very important place during the Second World War as well, where
Mm.
the V1 and the V2 were developed by Werner von Braun. And I was just listening to them, and we also did direction finding. So not only did I have to write down what they said, but I had to look at, we had a direction finding apparatus that would say what, how many degrees north they were. And I had to put that in as well as put in what they said and the time they said it. And I noticed that one of the people on the frequency was not German, was not East German. They had very distinctive accents, the East Germans. But it was a Russian. And I said to my supervisor, see this guy here, he's German, he's Russian. And from that, we deduced that this Russian was flying back and forwards, and we could tell because I was direction finding him.
Mm-hmm.
He was flying within an arc, say 25, 30 kilometers and back and forward. He was flying north of them because Peenemünde is right on the coast of the Baltic, and he was flying north of them to make sure that they didn't defect. And we deduced that from his accent. Now, I'm not sure that maybe it's possible nowadays. Maybe machines can tell, but I just wonder. You know, that's the kind of thing that a human being can do. Possibly machines can do it nowadays and much better than we did. It's quite possible.
One of the recent news came out, you might have seen it, like Russian intel intercepted a couple of, conversation by some German generals that put them in a serious, embarrassing situation.
Yes, I heard on German news that what had happened was one of the participants in this conversation was visiting a military conference in Singapore, and he joined in the conversation from a non-secure phone in his hotel room in Singapore.
Oh my.
That's what the Germans are saying, and that's quite possibly the case.
Oh my.
Just a stupid thing like that, absolutely against all of your training. All of your training tells you not to do that, but people are human,
Oh my God.
So that quite possibly is what happened. That may be an excuse on the part of the Germans to show that this really was just a one-off mistake, and it was not a structural mistake of their communication security. And who knows?
Because that question will be asked, that what else that you know?
Well, exactly. And the whole point about these communications intelligence, and this has been the case for over 100 years now, since we've had radio communications. The whole point is you never know what has been. You should always assume that unless you are on an obviously secure telephone or secure radio link, that it's been encoded, you should always assume that you're being listened to if it's an open line, and avoid saying anything. But people are stupid that way. They forget, and they let things slip. This is what happens all the time.
But I think the bigger question will be like, if the chances are that Russian side also intercepted the secured line as well, then that's a totally different ballgame.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. They will be going over the entire system with a fine-tooth comb to make sure there are no leaks. But it's inherently difficult, and you can never be completely sure. Never.
And I think especially when there's a live war happening right now.
Yes.
So I mean, it can harm people. It can harm people's lives.
It can, and I think one of the most dangerous things to come out of it, apart from the discussion about the Taurus missile, one of the most dangerous things to come out of it was the fact that they said there were British troops on the ground in Ukraine. Whether that is the case or not, who knows? It wouldn't surprise anybody. But it's a very serious matter if that is the case. But everybody's tiptoeing around, trying not to allow this situation to escalate. But in at the end of the day,
Mm.
you can't prevent things becoming known to the enemy. They're now referring to Russia as the enemy, which is interesting, as opposed to the opponent or our competitors. It's I think it's a very dangerous time.
Because like part of the things you were saying that what the job you are doing is like disciplined job, and it's a science. There are all kind of structure there, and if you don't follow them, there will be situation where you can actually harm people. So it's like serious undertaking what you were doing during that time.
They were, and we were rarely aware of it. We were young men in a decadent city, and certainly more interested in beer and women than we were in the global politics of what we were doing. Most of us were quite irresponsible about what we were doing and didn't really spend too much time thinking about it. There was one occasion when I was listening to cosmonauts, Russian cosmonauts who came over every 90 minutes, and it was at night, and we could hear them for about possibly 10 minutes, and I would be wakened up, and I would have to go through and okay, we get acquisition of signal, and then we'd hear them for 10 minutes, and then we would lose them again, obviously, when they went over the horizon. And I remember one of them saying something about he'd lost his pencil, and his pencil was floating away from him. And that was interesting because he did refer to it as a pencil, karandash. So we knew that they actually used pencils. The Americans spent millions on developing a ballpoint pen that could work in zero gravity, and the Russians used pencils, which is interesting. I mean, much more sensible thing to do. So that was at night, and I went. I finished my shift and went to bed at 8:30 after having breakfast in the mess. And I woke up in the afternoon, and these three men had died on re-entry. And that was one of the few times that I realized I was actually dealing with human beings. They weren't just disembodied voices in the distance that I was just writing down. And I resented, because I would rather have been sleeping. I go, wakened up every 80 minutes or every 3/4 of an hour. I would go back and I would sleep and get wakened up. And I resented them. But when I woke up that afternoon and heard that they had died on re-entry, it really, really hit me. I can still feel it to this day. That I realized, these are human beings. We did not think of them as being enemies. Nobody did. We were just doing a job. And I'm sure they felt the same way as well. An interesting thing about the average military person, how little they actually think about the other people as being actual human beings. And if you do, you don't feel them, you don't think of them as enemies.
Because that's like your dad's memory when he was in Egypt, like his his understanding about German, like rather than enemies, it kind of fascinated by the other side.
They were just doing a job. But one of my dad's stories was they were in a convoy in the desert near Mirza Matruh, and they were actually in the desert, and an American Messerschmitt, they could hear the engine coming close, so they all dived out of the trucks and into the ditch at the side of the road, which they'd been taught to do. And the German fighter flew over them, and there was no machine gun fire. And he flew past them and then circled round, and he came back, and he he kind of leant, his plane was at an angle, and he went to indicate that his guns were empty or they had jammed, and then he kind of did thumbs up and flew on again. And I thought that was just amazing, that if his guns had not jammed or had not been empty, he would have tried to kill them. And the absurdity of that is quite amazing. But that was one of my dad's stories, and he liked the Germans, they're punctual, they're efficient, and they didn't kill me, which is probably more important.
Because I really want to finish the German part of your life.
Yes.
So can you just kind of a bit of conclusion here, how it ended? When did you decide that time to move on? Or it's just the way it was, people had to move on?
When I left the Air Force, I tried to live in the south of Scotland for a couple of months and hated it and couldn't wait to get back to Berlin. So I went back to Berlin as a civilian, and a friend of mine ran the transport for the Siemens washing machine factory.
Yeah.
And so he offered me a job as a forklift driver. So I thought, great, yes, this is great. I don't need to get a haircut. I don't need to shave. And and I don't need to think. I can just drive a forklift. This is magic. So problem was my German was reasonable, but not very good, not as good as it could have been, because I'd spent all my time either speaking English or Russian. So really, I spent the first 6 months driving the forklift and learning German. And what I learned, and I can still do it to this day, I learned working class Berlin dialect, which is quite different from Hochdeutsch, from standard German. Yeah. So I did that for a year. I then thought, no, I do actually prefer thinking. I loved the job. Being a forklift driver was quite amazing. And I saw an advert for the German Performing Rights Society, the GEMA, and they were looking for a what they called a Fremdkorrespondent, a foreign correspondent, and they were looking for somebody who spoke English and French, and of course German. They were expecting a German to apply for the job, so I applied for it, and they gave me a job. And when they learned that I spoke Russian as well, that was very convenient. So I worked there for several years, and eventually, because I dealt with music publishers, I had played in a band, by the way, during all my time when I was in the Air Force. I played bass guitar. And I used to, in my job at the Performing Rights Society, dealt with music publishers in West Germany. And I was offered a job in Frankfurt, which I turned down. And then I was offered a job in Munich, which I accepted. So I left the GEMA and moved to West Germany, and helped to set up Warner Brothers Music in Munich. It was already there, but in a small office, and they wanted to expand. So I was given the job of Verlagsleiter, which is it's difficult to translate, but it's we called the title I gave myself was Director of Administration, which was a fancy title. I was a director of the company, kind of thing, and I worked there for a few years, which was really interesting. Met my then wife, who's American, and we eventually decided to move to California, Southern California, where she came from. And so I moved there with her. In the meantime, we'd had a daughter. We got married in California,
Mm.
and
Mm.
I moved there.
Like in total, how many years you spent in Germany from the
Uh,
beginning to?
yeah, from 68 to 81,
Wow.
right? And then I moved to then when I was in California, I worked for a firm of accountants, and we did audits of music publishers.
Mm.
So they sent me to Europe, and ironically, was sent back to Germany to
Mm.
do an audit in Frankfurt. Although I wasn't a qualified accountant,
Mm.
but they wanted me for my language abilities and that kind of thing. Um, so I eventually got tired of that, and I wanted to. I thought it was ironic that I was qualified in Russian, but my German was fluent.
Mm.
So I decided to go to university, and I went to UCLA, and did my undergraduate degree, and then I did my graduate degree, as they called it in America,
Mm.
postgraduate, and I was then going to do my PhD. Started off
Mm.
working on my PhD, and my then wife decided to move back to Germany. So in 1990, I moved back to Germany to be
Mm.
in the same country as my daughter and my then ex-wife.
Mm.
And we had divorced by that time. I lived in Berlin. I stayed with friends for a while until I got a flat.
Does it mean did you have a chance to see that the fall of Berlin Wall as well?
I missed it. I was actually in California, in Topanga Canyon in Southern California, just over the hill from Malibu, when the wall came down.
Mm.
And we went, it was December, it was just before New Year, 1989, that I managed to get back to Germany.
Mm.
Um, and we went to Berlin, and I saw the Berlin Wall more or less disintegrating. People were chipping away at them at the stone of the wall. They called them die Mauerspechte,
Mm.
the wall woodpeckers, because you could hear the tick 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 of
Mm.
people breaking off pieces of the wall.
Mm.
Um, so yeah, so I was gutted to have missed the actual night when the wall came down. Yeah, yeah.
Mm. Mm. Because I
Um,
mean, you lived very close to the Cold War,
Yeah, yeah, very much.
and like how did your brain work? Because suddenly, the whole Cold War is just gone from your memory.
Yeah. Um, it, if I may, I can give you an analogy from my own life.
Mm.
When I was at UCLA, it was 1984,
Mm.
and the Los Angeles Olympics
Yeah.
uh, were running in 1984 in the summer. So there was no summer university. Usually UCLA had summer courses. There were
Mm.
two short semesters in the summer that you could take courses.
Mm.
Um, and I actually got a job with the Olympics. There was as an accountant. Ironically, as I say, I'm not qualified as an accountant, but I blagged my way into the job. Um, and the headquarters of the UCLA of the Los Angeles Olympics in 1984 was at UCLA. They took over half of the campus and
Mm.
built accommodation, and all of the administration was run from there. The reason I'm saying this is it was a very, very exciting time. There was the only other time in my life when I worked at a war footing. We were working 24 hours a day. My worst day was 23 hours with no sleep. But it was so exciting. We were existing on adrenaline. It was amazing. Anyway, when the Olympics finished, um, and there was a very exciting finish to it because we were still working in the accounts, and the the closing ceremony, the final ceremony, was being held in the stadium down the town in Los Angeles, and we were in UCLA, which is about 10 miles away, and they gave us two buses because we were working up right to the very end before the closing ceremony started, and they put us in the buses, and we had a police escort. They closed off the freeways, so nobody was allowed to ride on the freeway. And there were two buses with us workers who had just finished working for the Olympics, and for two or three buses with sports people. And we drove from UCLA all along the freeway to the closing ceremony. And there was no traffic on the freeway. They completely closed it off for us to make it in time to get the finishing ceremony. The reason I'm saying this is when a couple of weeks later, everything had gone at UCLA. There was no sign of the Olympics. It was gone. It was back to being a university campus. And it was a disconcerting feeling to be back on campus again. And the office I'd worked in, the building was now a lecture hall. And there was no sign there had been an Olympic administration there. And if I may compare that feeling to driving through East Germany after the wall came down, and it was no longer a corridor. We could have turned right, we could have turned off left, we could have gone anywhere we wanted. There was a similar kind of feeling of cognitive dissonance of where has everything gone? What's happened? Very disconcerting. And I think what happened to the people of East Germany, of the GDR, was they had their country stolen from them. And I think the Germans made a big mistake by saying to the GDR, you no longer exist, but you're part of the Bundesrepublik Deutschland. You're part of the Federal Republic of Germany now, which they had been brought up to see as the enemy. And I used to explain to my students here, it would be as if in Scotland, one day we woke up and people said to us, Scotland no longer exists. In fact, it is England. It's exactly the same thing. Your country was taken away from you. And you were taken over by the big brother next door. Very, very disorienting, disconcerting thing to happen to people, and made a psychological mess of many, many people of the former GDR.
I just quickly interject here. I mean, that's one of the things, because the whole Cold War, it built on years after years, and then the collapse is like a flash, gone.
Yes.
And you are basically asking people, yeah, it's gone, so move on.
Yeah, so move on. Yeah.
It's not move on, because it's difficult, isn't it?
You cannot immediately move on. And I think for a lot of people, they couldn't move on at all. I remember being in the train going from West Berlin to, well, which by then was Berlin. It's no longer West Berlin, it's Berlin. After the wall came down, this must have been, say, 1991, 92. I was going down to West Germany to a phenomenal art exhibition in Essen. And I was sitting, as the train passed through where the wall had been, you could still see where the barriers had been. And this is where I passed through when I went in the military train all these years before. And there was an East German in the carriage with us. And I said, well, what do you think of the wall? It's gone. And he called it the Antifa-Schutzwall, the anti-fascist protection wall, is what East Germany had called it, what the GDR had called it. And in his mind, this had been built to protect them from the West.
Mm-mm.
And he still believed it, and maybe does to this day. Who knows? But it was really interesting to be confronted by the same external fact,
Mhm. Mm. Mm.
but I was seeing something totally different from what he was seeing.
Mm.
Uh, and there was no personal animosity whatsoever
No.
between us. None at all. Of course not. But we had lived in two different worlds, and
Mm.
now he was living in my world,
Yeah.
um, like it or not.
Mm. Mm.
It was very difficult, and I think a lot of West Germans were not aware of this. They were not cognizant of it. They did not empathize with the people of the GDR.
Mm. Mm.
Um, the East Germans called them die Besserwessis,
Mm.
the better Westerners. In other words, they knew everything better than the people in the East.
Mm. Mm.
Um, so
Like one of our friends, like Omar, used to live in East Germany after the
yes,
after the Cold War. Like
yes,
my understanding is, it seems like something is still going on there. They're still not, the history actually still staying with them.
yeah. Um, if you look at the political parties in the East, in the
Mm.
former the former GDR states, um, the Germans now call them the new Länder, the new states, which is an
Mm.
interesting euphemism, die neuen Länder. If you look at the political representation of the distribution of the parties, the AfD, the Alternative für Deutschland, some people say extreme right-wing party,
Mm.
is
Mm.
much more popular, much stronger in the East than it is in the West. Um,
Mm.
and it is interesting, which shows that politically, it's still a different country from West Germany.
Mm.
They still earn less than West Germans. I don't know what the difference
Mm.
is now, but it used to be 80% of the salary of West Germans.
Yeah. Yeah.
But they are there. It's still a different country.
Mm. Mm.
Um, it's interesting. You can change the system, but you can't change the people that quickly. Like,
No,
it will
no.
take generations to do it.
Mm. Mm. Germany actually played a big role in your life.
Very
And
much. Yeah.
and you actually, kind of the way I see it, part of you actually there,
Yes.
still
Um,
there. And I think there's some kind of connection there. And also there's some kind of bit of, positive, romantic idea about Germany. But also you can see the other side, the not so good side of a story. And
very much.
you kind of try to understand it rather than just like, oh, these things are bad. But I think that position you take is more like philosophical position. You try to understand what really happened to them, and
Very much.
why things are still difficult, and it will take more time to actually have that normalcy, the ideal society. But I mean, that's a myth again.
Uh, interesting concept, but I mean, I also knew when I lived in Bavaria, south of Munich,
Mm.
I was in the music business. I had two very close friends who both died only a few years ago. Gert and Irmgard. He had fought in the Second World War in the Luftwaffe. No, sorry, he was with the Wehrmacht. And he had been in the Eastern Front. He'd been at Stalingrad.
Oh my God.
And he was a radio operator. I met him through my hobby of radio amateur and of amateur radio. And he had been, he was there. He was in the Wehrmacht, and I thought he was a fascinating guy. And his wife, I remember his wife saying to me, we were just having a conversation one evening
Mm.
after a few beers, and I said something about Hitler. being the embodiment of evil. And she looked at me and said, I don't know why foreigners all say that Hitler was such an evil man. And now what do you say to that? I beg your pardon. Do you really mean that? And she really meant it. He was a wonderful man. I liked this woman. I'd spent hours and hours with them, with the two of them. But she was an unreconstructed lover of Adolf Hitler. That was interesting, So I've known people who had supported and fought for the Nazi regime, and known people from East Germany, and now living in the United Country. It's a fascinating country. Yeah.
So I mean, thank you, Colin. I mean, you have been such a kind man to spend. I think this is like fascinating story you told me today.
Thank you so much.
My students will appreciate absolutely.
Yeah. Well, I said to you that my father talked about nothing else but the war ever after until he died. And I tried desperately not to do that. So this is a very unusual thing for me to do. And I'm very flattered that you find it interesting.
Because these are amazing stories, absolutely amazing story. And we just don't, listen to it anymore. It's just gone from our memory. But these memories actually, build the world where we are living now.
Exactly. I think if we don't pay attention to what has happened in the past, then I mean it's a cliche, that if you don't learn from history, you will repeat its mistakes. But just because it's a cliche doesn't necessarily mean it's tautological. It is true. We tend not to learn from our previous mistakes and gloss over the bad bits. We shouldn't do that. I try not to glorify the past. Robert Pirsig in Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance says that the Greeks used to turn with their backs to the future and look at the past, which I think is an interesting picture. And I try desperately to turn around and have the past behind me and look at the future. So tonight was very unusual to be able to be given permission to go back over and look at the past.
Thank you. Really appreciate it.